tell us how your program is set up in terms of who meets with whom and that sort of thing? It's not a full band every day, in other words.
Sure. Yeah, with those 105 students, they weren't in one class. I actually was fortunate enough to have 3 classes that I could, decide how to split them up into. So I had my flutes and clarinets and saxophones together, and that was the first class of the day. And then after them came the trumpet class, which eventually became the high brass class, because I took some of those students and moved them to French horn and a few baritones. So it became kind of overall brass class. I actually had a lot of different instrument in there, with even some tuba players by the end of May, but they all started on trumpet. And then my next class was the euphonium and trombone class. I put them together, and eventually some of those baritone players moved over to tuba, and actually had some percussionists in there as well that I used with the trombone and euphonium class.
Could you talk about how you explain to the students and work with the students who started on trumpet, and then you decided, this isn't working, we need to move to another instrument? I mean, how did you make all that a positive thing for the students that they would want to continue with?
Well, when you see that trumpet players are going to be expected to play, second line G right away, that there's not going to be 100% success rate. You have to know from the beginning days of instruction that you're going to have to make some changes. Because kids who sign up for trumpet, most of us don't have very comprehensive, mouthpiece testing processes where we'll just know that kid is going to be successful and there's no doubt about it. So, from the beginning of instruction, even before the kids got their instruments, I said, we're all going to try the trumpet, and a lot of us are going to be successful with the trumpet, but that's because we're made for the trumpet, and other students aren't made for the trumpet; they're made for something else. And if you're made for something else, then you're going to be great at it. You're going to be great at the baritone, and I got to figure that out. It's my job to figure out what you're going to be best at. So you got to give me some time to work with you to figure that out. So if I do suggest you play something else, that just means that I came to my senses and I realized it. It didn't mean that you did anything wrong. Baritone's no worse than the trumpet. French horn's no better than the trumpet. It's just different people fit different things. And I got to figure out who you are before I decide.
Yeah. Yeah. And so out of that beginning trumpet class, how many kids started on trumpet, and then how many of those moved to something else?
I want to say about 35 kids started on trumpet. By the end of the year, and I just made some switches around April and May to French horn. So I had about 4 of those kids playing French horn by the end of the year, getting ready for 7th grade. In as early as October, November, I could tell some of those kids were not going to be trumpet players. So I moved about 4 of them to baritone right away, and they were very successful and very happy. We had our octaves in the class, and it was great. And then later on in the year, December and January, there was a few more students who were playing trumpet and they were getting the right pitches, but their tone quality wasn't developing the right way, and they could tell that. They always could tell that their feedback from me was that they were getting a pinched sound, or it wasn't very open, it wasn't very resonant, and so we experimented with a few more changes. So I think out of that class total, out of the 35 that I began with, 8 moved to baritone in the end, and about 4 moved up to French horn.
Wow. Yeah. And all happily so.
Yeah, 98% signed back up for next year,
Yeah.
so I think they're really happy about it, because now they have an instrument that just, it fits. And when the kids do move over to baritone, and they can play, low concert B flat, an F, and a high concert B flat right away without, sweating it, then, that's an opportunity for me to really give them praise and let them know that they made a good decision.
Yeah, right.
How much contact did you have with parents in this making these switches?
I had little to no contact with the parents making the switches. It was, at the very beginning of the year when I sent out letters and buying instruments and stuff, I encouraged all students to rent instruments. I didn't want anybody to get, locked into buying a $700 trumpet. So I encouraged everybody to rent, and I let them know that I was going to be trying to do this process of finding out where everybody fit in my band program. So when, there was a trumpet player who needed to move to baritone, I would approach that student. I'd be like, hey, I really think this would fit for you. Would you like to come in tomorrow and try it? And then they would try it, and I would say, you should talk to your parents and see if this is, a choice that would be good for you, because I think it would be. And the students really took care of it after that.
Huh. Isn't that great?
So, just to take this a little further, your previous 6th grade group, trumpet class. How am I going to ask this? I sense when I hear you talking that by sort of having permission to have 35 beginners on trumpet, and eventually a dozen or more of those won't be on trumpet. Just by, you know, the outlook of, well, this is possible, this is even likely, there's no problem with this. You know, you're thinking about this from day one.
I think setting the students up for the kind of environment where it's my job to pick what, you know, to find what instrument is right for you. I mean, from the very beginning stages, that made everything easier with instrument switches. And previously, I hadn't really done that. I had done mouthpiece tests and said, all right, you go buy a trumpet, and you know, you could rent it if you want to, but you're going to be a trumpet player. And I didn't really, you know, consider in the long run, had I been wrong, what was I going to do with myself? So, you know, having a class full of trumpet players in previous years that were not making the right sounds on the trumpet, you know, I might suggest to them, you know, let's move to a different instrument, let's try something else. It was almost always associated in the students' mind with a negative context. They weren't good enough.
Yeah.
They weren't doing well. Because I didn't set them up to say, look, it's okay. It might be, you know, that this just doesn't fit you. So switching students in previous years had been a bit harder for me. Switching them, you know, from trumpet to baritone, or making another instrument suggestion for them because the students didn't really receive it well, and oftentimes they would just quit band because they weren't good enough, you know, to do anything.
And was it primarily in the trumpet class where switches happened, or did it happen in other classes too? Any woodwind switches happen? Because of just fundamentally having a problem making
I
sound?
didn't make any woodwind switches, no. I mean, I didn't really see the need for any this year, although that's not to say that I may never make woodwind switches. This year I had a group of kids that it seemed that everybody just kind of fit their instrument that they were on, and I was able to work with them in the context of that instrument. Trumpet class seems to be the biggest problem. You know, a high brass instrument is really, you know, kind of specialized. You have to have a trumpet player to play the trumpet. The low brass instruments, I wasn't needing to make so many switches. I started out with just trombone and euphonium players, and those students, you know, played those instruments, and eventually I moved some of my euphonium players to tuba because I didn't start any tuba players. And I told those students at the beginning of the year as well, some of you guys are going to get to play the tuba, I'm going to pick you out if it fits, you know, that same situation. So I made some of those switches, although it was never usually because of a problem. Because there was, you know, if a euphonium player was playing partials that were too low or they couldn't get up to an F, it was some kind of other embouchure characteristic. It usually wasn't because that student just needed a bigger mouthpiece.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I think a lot of people probably, myself included, would expect that one instrument that you would switch people away from would be flute. But you didn't have any, all your flute players were able to form an embouchure.
This year I only had 12 flute players out of the 105. Next year I'll have about 20, maybe 15 to 20 flute players. I'm not opposed to switching those players. However, this year it just wasn't necessary.
Yeah, yeah. And can I ask, since we're talking about instruments and moving people to different instruments, when you're deciding like how you're going to fill out the rest of the saxophone section and the double reed sections, where are those players going to come from in 7th grade?
It'll be a lot of this. It'll be a lot of a student choice in some situations. You know, because for a saxophone player, eventually I expect all my saxophone players to learn how to play tenor saxophone and have some experience maybe with baritone saxophone. So the first student who volunteers, we usually get the first shot at it for saxophone, but we'll rotate through all of those. Picking double reed players, it'll be a combination of finding those students on clarinet and flute who are smart, good musicians, but maybe that instrument doesn't fit them, or maybe it does fit them, but they're capable of playing another instrument. It'll just be on case-by-case basis. Because in that big class setting, when we have full band in 7th grade, you know, those players are going to need to be the ones with a little more initiative, maybe willing to take lessons, maybe willing to work on their own a little bit more than some of the other players. So yeah, I think having known those students for a year, it's really going to help me make some of those choices.
Yep.